Inspector Purbright learned of the matter through a letter written in a hand that prized moderation. It arrived mid-morning, folded with care, the envelope addressed not quite formally enough to be officious, yet too correct to be familiar. The rector of St. Mildred's parish expressed mild concern regarding an irregularity of routine at the adjacent convent. One of the chapel doors, customarily secured after evening prayers, had been found ajar. No loss had occurred, no offence was suspected. Nevertheless, the rector felt it prudent that the police be informed, if only to forestall gossip, which in villages of long memory could be more disruptive than fact. Purbright read the letter twice. He had long experience of communications designed less to convey information than to manage its interpretation. On the phrase irregularity of routine suggested both deviation and discretion, a careful balancing act. He noted also what was absent. There was no date given for the occurrence, no time, and no mention of who had discovered the door. These were omissions that indicated either forgetfulness or agreement. Agreement was more likely. St. Mildred's stood slightly apart from the village proper, as if maintaining a respectful distance from secular preoccupations while still wishing to be observed. Purbright arrived shortly after noon, when the light fell evenly and there was little chance of dramatic shadow. The convent bell had recently finished marking the hour. A single nun crossed the courtyard with measured steps, neither hurrying nor lingering, her expression neutral, in a way that suggested training. That he was received in the small parlour by Sister Helen, whose manner combined courtesy with efficiency. She offered tea, which he accepted, and sat opposite him with her hands folded. The room was orderly to the point of abstraction. Nothing personal intruded. Purbright observed that such spaces were designed to leave no trace of those who passed through them. "You are most welcome, Inspector," Sister Helen said. "I trust the rector has not overstated the matter." "That remains to be seen," Purbright replied. "I am told a door was found open." "Yes, one of the side doors, after Compline." She inclined her head slightly, as if the hour itself carried explanatory weight. "It was, I assure you, an oversight." "Overlooks are rarely solitary," Purbright said mildly. "May I ask who noticed it?" Sister Helen paused only briefly. "One of the lay volunteers, Mrs. Lenton. She attends to the cleaning." "And this was unusual?" "In principle, yes. In practice, perhaps less so than we prefer to admit." She smiled faintly, acknowledging human limitation without assigning it. Purbright allowed the tea to cool. "Was anyone absent from the convent at the time?" "Only Sister Agatha, who had already left us." The name was delivered carefully, as if it had edges. "I see," Purbright said. "Recently?" "A matter of weeks. Her vocation required a reconsideration." "That is not uncommon," he observed. "No," Sister Helen agreed, "though it can be unsettling." They sat in mutual understanding of the word's elasticity. Purbright asked to see the chapel. Sister Helen rose at once, relieved perhaps to move from abstraction to geography. The door in question was unremarkable, solid, or recently polished. The lock functioned smoothly. Purbright noted that locks, like rules, often worked perfectly when no one was inconvenienced by them. "Was the door often used in the evenings?" he asked. "Occasionally," Sister Helen replied. "For parish meetings, discreet ones?" "Discretion requires trust," Purbright said. "Yes, and trust, once discussed, tends to diminish." In the sacristy, a notice board displayed committee rosters. Several names had been crossed out and rewritten. Sister Agatha's appeared faintly beneath fresh ink, as though erased without sufficient pressure. Purbright did not comment. Erasure was a sensitive craft. After thanking Sister Helen, he walked the short distance to the parish office. The secretary, Miss Crowther, produced correspondence with alacrity. Letters from Sister Agatha were neat, restrained, each raising small questions about access, timing, and propriety. None accused, none demanded. The replies, signed collectively, reassured without answering. Purbright had seen this pattern before, inquiry absorbed into generality. She was very conscientious, Miss Crowther said, perhaps overly so. Conscience is rarely convenient, Purbright replied. Was she troubled by the meetings held in the chapel? Miss Crowther adjusted a paperclip. Troubled is a strong word. She noticed things. Noticing is often the beginning of trouble, he said. Later at the post office, Purbright heard that Sister Agatha had ceased collecting her mail some days before her departure. At the grocer's, he learned she had asked about spare keys. Each remark was offered without emphasis, as if part of a communal effort to remain unperturbed. By the time he returned to the station, Purbright had formed no conclusion. That was as it should be. The matter of the open door seemed trivial only to those who had agreed on its triviality. He drafted preliminary notes, careful to use language that would not provoke alarm. Outside, the afternoon passed without incident. Yet, as he filed the rector's letter, Purbright found himself pausing over the phrase forestalled gossip. Gossip, he reflected, rarely required encouragement. It thrived best where silence was cooperative. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the door had been left open by accident or whether it had simply been noticed by the wrong person. Inspector Purbright did not hurry his inquiries. He had learned early that villages, like elderly relatives, resented impatience and punished it with selective memory. Instead, he allowed a day to pass before making further visits, permitting the matter of the chapel door to settle into local consciousness in whatever shape it preferred. By the following morning, the irregularity had already acquired the faint polish of explanation which suggested that it had been discussed, corrected, and quietly redistributed among responsible parties. His first call was upon Mrs. Lenton, the cleaner, whose cottage lay at the edge of the village where gardens grew larger and opinions more cautiously. She received him in a narrow sitting-room arranged to suggest tidiness rather than comfort. Mrs. Lenton herself embodied the same principle. She spoke precisely, with a faint air of apology for occupying space. "Yes, Inspector, it was I who found the door," she said, smoothing an already smooth apron. I mentioned it at the time." "To whom?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Lenton considered this. "I can't be certain. Someone responsible. There's always someone responsible." "And the response?" "Oh, understanding. Very understanding." She smiled briefly. "It was explained that allowances had been made. Circumstances, you understand." Purbright nodded. "Did this explanation satisfy you?" Mrs. Lenton hesitated, as though unsure whether satisfaction was required. "I slept less soundly, if that answers your question." It did, in a manner of speaking. Purbright thanked her and departed without further probing. People who slept poorly over small matters often knew more than they could articulate without impropriety. From there he went to the rector, who received him in a study arranged around authority rather than books. The rector spoke readily, with the confidence of a man accustomed to summarizing consensus. "The convent has always been generous in allowing parish use of its facilities," he said. "Occasionally that generosity requires flexibility." "And Sister Agatha objected to this flexibility?" Purbright asked. The rector smiled gently. "Objected is too strong. She was attentive, concerned with form." "Form has its uses," Purbright observed. "Indeed, but one must also consider spirit." The rector folded his hands. "Her departure was unfortunate, but perhaps inevitable." Purbright noted the phrasing. Departures were often made inevitable in retrospect. Later that afternoon, Purbright attended a meeting of the parish newsletter committee, having been invited with a politeness that carried faint obligation. The discussion concerned typeface, phrasing, and whether recent improvements to chapel security merited mention. It was agreed they did, provided the wording emphasized cooperation rather than correction. Sister Agatha's name did not arise, though Purbright noticed a pause when one member began a sentence and chose another. During a lull, he asked casually, "Was Sister Agatha involved in the committee?" "Oh, yes," a woman replied. "Very diligent. She kept notes." "And where are those notes now?" Purbright asked. Another pause followed, longer this time. "Filed," someone said with conviction but no detail. Purbright accepted this. Filing was a versatile concept. In the early evening he returned to the convent, where Sister Helen greeted him with unchanged composure. He mentioned the meetings held after Compline. "They were approved," she said. And discreet." "Discretion can be burdensome," Purbright replied. "Did Sister Agatha share that burden?" Sister Helen's expression altered slightly, not in discomfort but in calculation. She believed the chapel should remain inviolate. "And you disagreed?" "We believed," Sister Helen said carefully, "that accommodation was an expression of service." Purbright inclined his head. Service has many interpretations. Before leaving, he asked to see Sister Agatha's former cell. It was immaculate, almost aggressively so. No personal items remained, save a faint rectangle on the wall where something had once hung. "A calendar," Purbright suggested. "A notice," Sister Helen corrected. "A list of questions, I believe." "What became of it?" "It was removed. It seemed unnecessary." Unnecessary things often were. That night, Purbright reviewed his notes. Nothing improper had occurred. No rule had been broken that could not be reinterpreted. Yet the matter persisted, not as an offence, but as an unease. Sister Agatha had asked questions that required answers someone preferred not to give. The open door, he now suspected, had been less a mistake than a symbol, one that remained acceptable only so long as it went unremarked. As he extinguished the lamp, Purbright wondered not why Sister Agatha had left, but who had decided she should be the one to notice. Inspector Purbright spent the better part of the following day engaged in what he described, to no one in particular, as clerical archaeology. The parish office had produced several boxes of papers, offered with relief, and a faint anxiety that something might be found simply because it was being looked for. Moy Purbright assured Miss Crowther that he required nothing confidential, only illustrative. This distinction comforted her, though she did not ask how illustration differed from evidence. The papers consisted largely of minutes, circulars, and memoranda, all drafted in a language that favoured agreement over clarity. Purbright read them with the patience of a man accustomed to listening for what was not said. Committee meetings recorded unanimous decisions with remarkable regularity. Occasional dissent was absorbed into phrases such as "after discussion" or "with general assent." He noted how often these expressions coincided with matters of access, timing, and use of shared spaces. Sister Agatha appeared frequently in earlier records. Her contributions were concise, carefully worded, and invariably appended rather than incorporated. She raised points of order. She queried precedent. She suggested that certain arrangements be clarified in writing. None of these remarks were recorded as objections. They were simply noted and then overtaken by the next item on the agenda. At midday, Purbright was interrupted by a visit from Councillor Bream, who had heard, through channels both civic and devotional, that the inspector was taking an interest in parish affairs. Councillor Bream was a man of courteous bulk, whose opinions arrived well padded. "I trust," he said, settling himself with effort, "that this business is not being allowed to assume proportions." "Proportions tend to assume themselves," Purbright replied. "I merely observe them." Councillor Bream smiled. "The village values harmony." "Villages often do," Purbright said. "Sometimes at considerable expense." The councillor adjusted his cuffs. "Sister Agatha was exacting. Such temperaments can strain communal life." "Exactness can also protect it," Purbright observed. This was allowed to pass without comment. In the afternoon, Purbright visited the small house where Sister Agatha had lodged during her final weeks. The landlady, Mrs. Pike, was brisk and incurious, relieved to have the room vacant. "She kept to herself," Mrs. Pike said. "Polite. Asked about locks." "Frequently?" Purbright asked. "Enough to notice." Mrs. Pike shrugged. "She said she liked to know who was responsible for what." "And did she?" Mrs. Pike considered. "Not really." In the empty room, Purbright found nothing remarkable. No papers had been left behind, no personal effects overlooked. The bed was neatly made, although the pillow bore the faint impression of habitual restlessness. On the desk lay a single envelope, addressed but unposted. It contained no letter, only a folded sheet on which several questions had been written and then crossed out. They concerned access, authority, and accountability. At the bottom, one word remained uncrossed: permission. Purbright returned the paper to its place. He did not take it. Removal would have suggested importance. That evening, he dined alone at the modest hotel, where conversation travelled more freely between tables than within them. He overheard remarks about the convent, the meetings, and Sister Agatha's departure. Nothing was said directly. Instead, there were references to adjustment and fit. Purbright noted how often her name was paired with regret, and how rarely with inquiry. Later, or as he walked back to his room, the night porter remarked, "Quiet place, really. Only trouble comes when people start asking questions." "Questions have a way of arriving," Purbright said, "whether invited or not." In his room, he reviewed the day's impressions. No one had lied to him, precisely. Yet everyone had contributed to a version of events that required Sister Agatha's absence to function smoothly. Her concern with form had unsettled those who preferred spirit, though spirit appeared to be a flexible commodity. Before retiring, Purbright wrote a brief note to the rector requesting clarification on the authority under which evening meetings were approved. He phrased it politely, almost deferentially. The question itself, he suspected, would be more troubling than any answer. As he sealed the envelope, old Purbright reflected that the open door was no longer the central issue. Doors, after all, could be closed. What concerned him now was the quiet agreement that some questions, once asked, required the removal of the questioner. Inspector Purbright received the rector's reply 2 days later, delivered by hand as though the post might be indiscreet. The letter was courteous, expansive in tone, and economical with particulars. Evening meetings, the rector explained, were approved in principle by the parish council, with operational details left to custom. Custom, it appeared, had a habit of authorizing itself. Purbright read the letter once, then again, noting how authority dissolved gently when approached directly. He visited the parish council offices that afternoon, where the clerk produced a ledger of resolutions bound in aging cloth. All the entries were immaculate, their consistency suggesting long practice. Purbright asked about approval for chapel use after Compline. The clerk traced a finger down the page, paused, and smiled apologetically. "It would fall under general provisions," she said. "We did not think it necessary to specify." "Specificity can be burdensome," Purbright agreed. "It does, however, have advantages." The clerk inclined her head, acknowledging the sentiment without embracing it. She mentioned, as an aside, that Sister Agatha had once asked to see the ledger. She was very interested in procedure, the clerk said, as though this were a mild eccentricity. From there, Purbright walked to the small reading room maintained by the parish, a place intended for quiet improvement. Mrs. Talbot, who oversaw it, greeted him warmly. She spoke of Sister Agatha with affectionate restraint. She was very earnest, she said, always asking whether things were as they should be. And were they? Purbright asked. Mrs. Talbot smiled. They were as they had always been. Purbright reflected that this was rarely the same thing. In the late afternoon he attended evensong not as an act of devotion, but of observation. The congregation was modest, composed largely of those with an interest in appearances. He noted how the rector's sermon emphasized harmony and discretion, virtues presented as mutually reinforcing. Several listeners nodded at appropriate moments. Purbright wondered how many understood discretion to mean silence. After the service, he spoke briefly with Sister Helen, who had come over from the convent. She mentioned that Sister Agatha had written once, since leaving, a note of thanks for kindness shown. Did she express any regrets? Purbright asked. Only that she had caused inconvenience, Sister Helen replied. She was very considerate. Consideration, Purbright thought, was often demanded most strongly of those who disrupted comfort. That evening, Purbright reviewed the parish newsletter proofs. A small paragraph announced improved security arrangements, attributing them to communal effort. No cause was given, no individual was mentioned. The language was careful, almost congratulatory. Purbright imagined Sister Agatha reading it, noting what had been achieved only after her departure. Before retiring, he walked past the convent. The side door was firmly shut, its lock newly polished. A small notice had been affixed, requesting that it remain closed after evening prayers. The wording was courteous, the implication final. Purbright paused, considering the notice's timing. He wondered who had suggested it, and who had agreed without discussion. As he turned away, a light appeared briefly in an upper window, then was extinguished. Nothing improper was implied. Yet Purbright felt the faint unease of a matter settled too neatly. Doors could be closed, notices posted, and records adjusted. What could not be so easily managed was the knowledge that someone had once asked why things were done as they were. He returned to his lodgings with the sense that the village had reached a consensus. Consensus, he knew, was often achieved by narrowing the range of acceptable questions. Sister Agatha's absence now made the remaining questions theoretical, and therefore safe. Still, Purbright suspected that theories had consequences, particularly for those who noticed when doors were left ajar. Inspector Purbright was conscious by the 5th day of his inquiries that the village had begun to relax. This relaxation did not take the form of openness. Rather, it manifested as a courteous assumption that the matter was nearing its natural conclusion. People greeted him with the mild encouragement reserved for officials who had behaved themselves. Several expressed the hope that he was finding everything satisfactory, a phrase which managed to be both supportive and advisory. He began the morning with a return visit to the convent, this time at Sister Helen's invitation. Coffee was served instead of tea, a small concession to informality that suggested confidence. Sister Helen spoke at some length about the convent's history, its relationship with the parish, and the necessity of adaptation in changing times. Purbright listened with the attentiveness of a man aware that generalities often concealed the sharpest particulars. "You will understand," Sister Helen said, "that we cannot afford to appear uncooperative." Appearances are often the more demanding obligation, Purbright replied. She smiled politely. Service requires compromise. Compromise usually does, he said, though not everyone is equally well positioned to make it. There was a brief pause. Sister Helen acknowledged the remark with a slight inclination of the head, as one might acknowledge an unavoidable draught. Before leaving, Purbright asked whether any record existed of Sister Agatha's concerns beyond the committee minutes. Sister Helen considered this. She kept personal notes, she said. Reflections, I believe. And their whereabouts? They were disposed of, Sister Helen replied, at her request. Purbright did not ask how the request had been conveyed. From the convent he walked to the village library, a modest building maintained with quiet pride. The librarian, Mr. Dawkins, had known Sister Agatha well enough to exchange opinions of weather and punctuation. He spoke of her with faint admiration. She had a habit of reading the parish bylaws, he said. Most people prefer fiction. Bylaws have their own narratives, Purbright observed. Mr. Dawkins nodded. She said they were useful when one wished to understand how things happened without appearing to happen. Purbright thanked him for this insight. At midday he lunched at the hotel, where the proprietor informed him that bookings for parish events were now being taken with greater clarity. The tone suggested relief. Purbright wondered how much clarity had been absent, and who had benefited from the ambiguity. In the afternoon he called upon Councillor Bream again, this time at the councillor's home. Mrs. Bream presided over the sitting room with efficient cordiality. The councillor himself seemed pleased to see Purbright, as though confident that no unpleasantness remained. I trust we are close to resolution, Councillor Bream said. Resolution is a flexible concept, Purbright replied. I am still considering the matter of authority. Councillor Bream frowned slightly. Authority has always been shared. Shared authority can be difficult to locate, Purbright said, particularly when responsibility is in question. The councillor shifted in his chair. Sister Agatha's concerns were theoretical. Most concerns are, Purbright agreed, until they are not. This exchange concluded the visit. As Purbright left, he noted that the councillor's relief had been replaced by mild irritation, an improvement perhaps, but not reassurance. That evening, Purbright reviewed the few remaining documents in his possession. Among them was a memorandum circulated some months earlier, proposing a formal schedule for chapel use. It had been deferred pending further consideration. The signature line bore several names, including Sister Agatha's, hers the only one written with visible pressure. He folded the paper and returned it to its envelope. The schedule had never been adopted. Instead, the village had chosen the easier course of quiet adjustment, removing the source of discomfort rather than addressing it. As dusk settled, Purbright walked once more past the chapel. The door was closed, the notice intact. Two parishioners stood nearby, speaking in low tones. They fell silent as he passed, then resumed with an ease that suggested practice. Purbright did not turn back. In his room later, he began drafting what would eventually become his report. He used careful language, noting the absence of malice and the presence of misunderstanding. He emphasized the importance of clarity, accountability, and recorded agreement. The tone was conciliatory. It would be well received. Yet as he set down his pen, Purbright hesitated. One detail continued to trouble him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. Sister Agatha had asked questions. The village had answered by agreeing she need not ask them any more. He closed the file, leaving the final paragraph unwritten. The case was nearly complete. Whether it was finished was another matter entirely. Inspector Purbright posted his draft report the following morning, addressed to the Chief Constable with copies indicated for the parish council and the diocesan office. It was, by design, a document that could be read quickly and forgotten slowly. He had taken care to phrase his conclusions as observations rather than judgments, noting the absence of criminality and the presence of administrative ambiguity. Ambiguity, he suggested, had a tendency to invite misunderstanding, particularly where tradition was relied upon in place of record. It was not a document that accused anyone of wrongdoing, but it did not entirely absolve them of thoughtlessness either. With the report dispatched, Purbright might reasonably have considered his involvement concluded. Instead, he found himself lingering in the village with no official purpose, a habit acquired over years of noticing that the most revealing moments occurred after authority had ostensibly withdrawn. His presence was now greeted with relaxed courtesy. Several villagers remarked that matters seemed to have settled themselves, a phrase that relieved individuals of the burden of agency. He spent the late morning in the churchyard, ostensibly examining a map of burial plots provided by the sexton. In practice, he observed patterns of arrival and departure. Two members of the parish council spoke briefly near the vestry door, their conversation pausing when they noticed him, and then resuming with an exaggerated air of casualness. Purbright reflected that secrecy was rarely about concealment, it was more often about timing. At noon, he encountered Sister Helen again, this time outside the convent gates. She greeted him with warmth that suggested finality. "I understand your report has been sent," she said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "I hope it proves satisfactory." "I am sure it will," Sister Helen said. "We are grateful for your discretion." "Discretion," Purbright said, "is sometimes mistaken for agreement." She smiled politely, as though the distinction were academic. Before parting, Sister Helen mentioned that the convent had received another letter from Sister Agatha, forwarding address still unknown. "She writes very kindly," Sister Helen said. "She hopes we are all well." "Does she mention the village?" Purbright asked. "Only indirectly. She says she's relieved not to be a cause of inconvenience." Purbright inclined his head. "That is a considerable relief." Sister Helen did not pursue the remark. In the afternoon, Purbright visited the reading room once more. Mr. Dawkins was cataloguing donations with visible satisfaction. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a parcel had arrived for Sister Agatha some weeks earlier after her departure. It had been returned unopened. "Do you recall the sender?" Purbright asked. Mr. Dawkins adjusted his spectacles. "The parish council, I believe. Some papers." "Minutes," Purbright suggested. "Possibly, or drafts." Mr. Dawkins shrugged. It seemed unnecessary to forward them. "Unnecessary things often are," Purbright said. As the day wore on, Purbright sensed a mild irritation beneath the village's composure, not directed at him personally, but at the persistence of the matter itself. The open door had been closed, the notice affixed, procedures clarified to the extent that clarity was desired. Sister Agatha had gone. What remained was an aftertaste of scrutiny, an awareness that the village had been observed while preferring not to be. That evening, Purbright returned to the chapel one final time. Evensong had ended, and the building was empty. The side door was locked, the notice newly laminated. He stood for a moment, listening to the quiet, which was thorough and intentional. As he turned to leave, he noticed a small detail he had not seen before. The notice bore two signatures at the bottom, added in careful handwriting. One was the rector's, but the other was Councillor Bream's. Authority, it seemed, had at last been located and displayed. Purbright wondered how long it had required Sister Agatha to ask for precisely that. He walked back toward his lodgings, under a sky that promised uneventful weather. The village lights came on one by one, modest and reassuring. In his room, he packed his case with the efficiency of a man accustomed to departures that required no ceremony. Before extinguishing the lamp, Purbright reviewed his notes once more. The case, as recorded, was complete. Yet he found himself adding a final annotation in the margin, not intended for circulation. It consisted of a single question, written lightly, almost as an indulgence. Who benefits most when nothing is written down? He closed the notebook without answering it. Some questions, he knew, were not meant to be resolved, only remembered. Inspector Purbright delayed his departure by a single morning, a decision he did not trouble to justify even to himself. Trains, he knew, were forgiving in that respect. The village had assumed his work concluded, and this assumption had already begun to shape behavior. People moved with a little more freedom, spoke with marginally less care. Closure, once anticipated, exerted its own influence. He took breakfast in the hotel dining room, where the proprietor addressed him with relaxed cordiality. The conversation concerned weather, bookings, and the expectation that things would now return to their customary calm. Purbright listened with interest. Customary calm, he reflected, was rarely the same thing as innocence. After breakfast, he walked to the post office to settle a minor account. While there, he observed Miss Phelps sorting mail with methodical concentration. She mentioned, without emphasis, that a letter had arrived for Sister Agatha that very morning. "Forwarded?" Purbright asked. Miss Phelps shook her head. "No address given. It's been set aside." "May I see it?" Purbright asked, phrasing the request as gently as possible. Miss Phelps hesitated, then nodded. The envelope bore the parish crest and was addressed in the careful hand of Miss Crowther. Purbright did not open it. He merely noted the return address and the weight of the paper inside. "It will likely be returned," Miss Phelps said. "Yes," Purbright agreed. "Returned letters have a way of accumulating meaning." He left the post office and walked, without haste, toward the parish offices. The door was open. Inside, Miss Crowther was at her desk, arranging papers with a diligence that suggested anticipation. "I was just about to send another copy," she said when she saw him. "For the records?" "Of what?" Purbright asked. "The revised minutes," she replied. "From the meeting last autumn." "The one Sister Agatha attended?" Miss Crowther paused. "Yes." "And the revisions?" "Clarifications," she said. "We thought it best." Purbright accepted this. Clarification, like revision, was often applied retrospectively. He asked to see the original minutes. Miss Crowther produced them with visible reluctance. The document was unremarkable, save for a marginal note written in a different hand. It queried the authority under which the chapel had been allocated for evening use. The note was initialed simply A. "And this?" Purbright asked. Miss Crowther adjusted her glasses. "It was never raised formally." "Nevertheless, it was written down," Purbright said. "Yes," she agreed. Which was perhaps the difficulty. Purbright thanked her and returned the papers. He did not request copies. Possession was unnecessary. Awareness was sufficient. Late that morning, he encountered Councillor Bream outside the church. The councillor appeared faintly surprised to see him. "I thought you had gone," Councillor Bream said. "Almost," Purbright replied. They walked together for a short distance. Councillor Bream spoke of upcoming events and the satisfaction of resolved matters. "It is good to have things settled," he said. "Settlements often favour those who remain," Purbright observed. The councillor laughed politely, then fell silent. Before leaving the village, Purbright returned once more to the convent. Sister Helen received him briefly with composed warmth. "I wish to say goodbye," Purbright said. "That is kind," Sister Helen replied. "We trust you found your inquiries sufficient." "Sufficient is a useful word," Purbright said. "It suggests adequacy without enthusiasm." She smiled, uncertain whether this was praise. As he turned to go, Sister Helen added, "Sister Agatha asked, in her last letter, whether the door was now kept locked." "And is it?" Purbright asked. "Yes," Sister Helen said, "always." Purbright inclined his head. "She will be reassured." Outside, the air was cool and unremarkable. The village went about its business with renewed confidence. Purbright made his way to the station, carrying little beyond his case and a sense of mild dissatisfaction. On the platform, he removed his notebook and read through his final annotation once more. Who benefits most when nothing is written down? He did not amend it. The answer, he suspected, was already known to those who mattered. As the train arrived, Purbright closed the notebook and boarded without ceremony. The village receded, intact and untroubled. Yet somewhere beyond its borders a letter remained unopened, a question unacknowledged, and a woman relieved of inconvenience by absence. The door, at least, was closed. Inspector Purbright did not think of the matter again for several days, which was unusual enough to be noteworthy. The village, having receded into the orderly distance of concluded business, ought to have remained there. Instead, it returned intermittently, not as recollection, but as irritation. Certain phrases repeated themselves with faint persistence, clarified procedure, no longer necessary for the sake of harmony. They were phrases that settled nothing, but they did create a surface upon which one could stand without slipping. It was a memorandum from the diocesan office that finally drew his attention back. The document, forwarded as a matter of routine, concerned guidance on the use of consecrated spaces for non-liturgical purposes. It was neither new nor controversial, but appended to it was a brief note from the parish council of St. Mildred's expressing gratitude for timely clarification and confirming that local arrangements were now fully aligned. Purbright read the note twice. The timing, he observed, was exact. He sent a polite inquiry to the diocesan clerk, asking when the parish council's request for guidance had been received. The reply arrived promptly. The request, it appeared, had been submitted some months earlier, then withdrawn, then resubmitted shortly after Sister Agatha's departure. No explanation was offered for this sequence, nor was one expected. That afternoon, Purbright walked to the records office, where diocesan correspondence was kept with a reverence approaching affection. The clerk, a man of conscientious neutrality, produced the file without comment. Purbright examined the withdrawn request. It bore several annotations in different hands, one of which he recognized as Councillor Bream's. Another was initialed simply A. She was thorough, the clerk remarked. She wanted everything aligned before proceeding. "And the withdrawal?" Purbright asked. The clerk shrugged. Consensus changed. "Consensus," Purbright said, "is an interesting mechanism." The clerk smiled without enthusiasm. In the early evening, Purbright dined alone, as he preferred when considering matters that did not require appetite. He reflected that Sister Agatha's influence had not been eliminated so much as redistributed. Her questions had found answers only once she was no longer present to receive them. This was not an uncommon resolution. Institutions often addressed inconvenience by removing its embodiment. Later, as he reviewed his notes, Purbright became aware of a faint asymmetry in the sequence of events. Procedures had been clarified, notices posted, signatures affixed. Authority, previously diffuse, had become visible and documented. All of this had occurred only after Sister Agatha's absence, made such measures uncontroversial. The village had not objected to clarity, it had objected to being asked for it. He drafted a short addendum to his report, addressed privately to the chief constable. It contained no accusations, only an observation regarding timing and process. He concluded with the suggestion that reputational risk was often managed more efficiently than ethical uncertainty. It was, he suspected, an addendum that would be acknowledged and filed. Before sealing the envelope, Purbright hesitated. He reread the final sentence, then struck out a single word, replacing it with another less precise. Precision, he reflected, could be impolite. That night, he dreamed briefly of the chapel door, neither open nor closed, but held in balance by an unseen hand. The dream was not troubling, merely instructive. The following morning he received a final letter, forwarded from the village. It was from Sister Agatha. The handwriting was unchanged, the tone courteous. She thanked him for his attention and remarked that she was pleased to hear matters had been resolved satisfactorily. She added, almost as an aside, that clarity, once achieved, tended to arrive too late for those who required it most. She hoped, nevertheless, that the door was now secure. Purbright folded the letter and placed it with his papers. He did not reply. Replies in such circumstances risked sentiment. As he prepared to leave his office, he paused once more over his notebook. The question he had written remained unanswered, but it now seemed less abstract. Who benefits most when nothing is written down? The answer, and he realized, was not a person or a council, but a condition. Comfort. Comfort thrived where uncertainty was permitted to linger without examination. He closed the notebook and switched off the light. Somewhere a door was locked with admirable diligence. Somewhere else a question remained, properly filed and no longer necessary. Inspector Purbright encountered the matter again in the form it most often preferred, indirectly. It arrived as a reference during a routine meeting at headquarters mentioned by a superintendent who prided himself on being broadly informed. The superintendent observed that diocesan guidance on shared spaces had recently been clarified in several rural parishes, a development he attributed to improved liaison rather than to any specific incident. Purbright acknowledged this with a nod. Clarification, he knew, rarely occurred without a prior inconvenience. After the meeting, he returned to his office and reviewed the file once more, not with the intention of adding to it, but to observe how it now presented itself. The documents lay in careful order, their cumulative effect one of administrative calm. No contradictions remained. Questions had been absorbed into procedures. Names had been reduced to initials or removed entirely. It was, by conventional standards, a successful conclusion. He noted, however, that Sister Agatha's name appeared nowhere in the final papers. This was not unusual. Individuals who complicated matters were often best acknowledged obliquely. Purbright considered whether this omission was deliberate or merely efficient. The distinction, he suspected, would not trouble those responsible. Later that afternoon, he received a visit from Miss Crowther, who had travelled to headquarters on unrelated business and taken the opportunity to call upon him. She appeared slightly uneasy, though she maintained her accustomed politeness. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said. "Not at all," Purbright replied. "Please sit." They exchanged remarks of a general nature before Miss Crowther produced a small envelope from her handbag. "I thought you should have this," she said. "It was misfiled." Inside was a carbon copy of a letter sent months earlier to the diocesan office. It requested guidance on chapel usage and bore several signatures, including Sister Agatha's. The date preceded her departure by some weeks. "It was withdrawn," Miss Crowther said quickly. "As you know." "Yes," Purbright said. or withdrawn things often retain interest. Miss Crowther hesitated. I sometimes wonder whether we acted too hastily. Haste, Purbright replied, is often disguised as necessity. She smiled faintly, then rose to leave. At the door, she paused. Sister Agatha wrote again, she said. She asked whether the guidance had been implemented. And what did you reply? Purbright asked. I did not, Miss Crowther said. It seemed unnecessary. After she left, Purbright placed the letter with the rest of the file. The sequence was now complete. Request, withdrawal, departure, clarification. The pattern was almost elegant. That evening, he dined with a colleague who expressed mild admiration for the efficiency with which the matter had been resolved. No fuss, the colleague said. No damage. Damage, Purbright replied. Art is not always immediate. He returned home later than usual and sat for some time without turning on the light. The case no longer occupied his thoughts in any practical sense, yet it remained present, like a piece of furniture one learned to walk around. He reflected that Sister Agatha's insistence on record and permission had not been unreasonable, it had merely been inconvenient. The village had addressed inconvenience by removing its source, then adopting the source's recommendations without attribution. Before retiring, Purbright took out his notebook once more. He read the question he had written days earlier and found that it no longer required revision. Who benefits most when nothing is written down? The answer, he now thought, was not comfort alone, but continuity. Continuity depended upon the absence of interruption, and interruption was most often caused by those who noticed discrepancies. The following morning, Purbright received a brief notice from the diocesan office confirming that St. Mildred's had been commended for its proactive approach to governance. The language was warm, the implications reassuring. He filed the notice without comment. As he closed the drawer, he imagined Sister Agatha somewhere unfamiliar, reading a letter that did not answer her questions, or perhaps no letter at all. He wondered whether she would feel vindicated by the changes made in her absence, or merely tired. Purbright turned back to his desk and began work on another matter, one that promised a different kind of resolution. Yet as he did so, he remained aware of a small, persistent doubt. It concerned not the chapel door, now firmly locked, nor the village, now settled, but the ease with which propriety had been restored once the need to explain it had been removed. Inspector Purbright returned to St. Mildred's some weeks after his previous visits, prompted less by official instruction than by the persistent murmur of unfinished observation. The village had resumed its habitual calm, and yet, as he had often discovered, calm in small communities carried an undercurrent that only a careful observer could detect. The chapel doors were locked, notices laminated, and committee records amended to indicate clarity and compliance. Everything appeared in order. And yet he felt a mild expectation, as though the air itself waited for a question that had not been asked. He began with the parish office, where Miss Crowther greeted him with polite composure. She had prepared the latest set of minutes and correspondence for his inspection. "We've ensured that all documentation is up to date," she said, gesturing toward a neatly stacked folder. Her tone implied both relief and subtle pride. Purbright leafed through the papers slowly. The file contained the expected formal records, the parish council's approvals, the diocesan guidance, and the laminated notice regarding chapel use. Among them lay the carbon copy of Sister Agatha's final request, filed carefully under correspondence, but now annotated in faint pencil by an unknown hand, implemented post-departure. Purbright paused. The annotation was factual, almost mundane, yet its presence suggested a small, deliberate acknowledgement of someone who had already left. "I noticed this note," he said, indicating the pencil mark. Do we know who made it? Miss Crowther glanced down. I believe Councillor Bream added it to ensure the record reflected the outcome, nothing more. She hesitated, then added, though it seems, with hindsight, rather unnecessary. Unnecessary, Purbright observed, is often what the absent require most. They spoke no more on the subject, yet the silence carried a soft acknowledgment. Miss Crowther's deference was not directed at him, but at the residual authority of the person who had posed the questions in the first place. He noted how reputations persisted in records long after individuals had departed. Leaving the office, Purbright strolled toward the convent. Sister Helen was in the courtyard, tending to a small garden. She greeted him with her usual composed warmth. "It is good to see you again, Inspector," she said. I trust the village has remained orderly in your absence?" "Orderly, yes," Purbright replied, "though I suspect the appearance of order is rarely coincidental." She inclined her head as though acknowledging the balance between observation and discretion. "We continue to lock the chapel after Compline," she added, pointing to the side door, "as Sister Agatha requested." "And that satisfies the requirement?" "For us, yes, though as you may observe, satisfaction is seldom complete." Her words were carefully measured. Purbright examined the door. The lock was newly polished. A faint groove along the handle suggested frequent use. He wondered whether the attention to detail had been motivated by principle or by the village's desire to demonstrate propriety. Perhaps both. As he walked through the garden, he noticed the convent notice board displaying a schedule for parish meetings, amended and printed neatly. One slot had been left blank, as though awaiting an assignment. It was minor, almost imperceptible, but Purbright noted it. Absences, whether of people or of action, often spoke louder than presence. Later he sat in the small parish reading room, a quiet refuge where few villagers ventured. Mr. Dawkins, the librarian, was arranging new donations. Purbright observed him with mild curiosity. "She asked questions," Mr. Dawkins said suddenly, without preamble. "Sister Agatha, I mean. About authority, about procedure, about what ought to be done when no one was looking." "Indeed," Purbright said. "And were her questions accommodated?" Mr. Dawkins considered. "Yes, eventually, but only after she left." Purbright smiled faintly. A predictable resolution, I'm afraid. One that ensures continuity at the cost of inconvenience." The librarian nodded. "And yet the village sleeps easier." Purbright rose, leaving the documents untouched. Continuity, he reflected, required more than compliance. It demanded selective forgetting. As evening descended, he returned once more to the chapel. The last light of day fell evenly across the stone steps, neither shadow nor highlight revealing more than the eye could comfortably take. He checked the lock. It was secure. The laminated notice reflected a modest glow from the porch light. All appearances were of propriety maintained. Yet a detail caught his eye. A small, nearly imperceptible scratch along the corner of the notice, as if someone had brushed against it repeatedly. It was minor, perhaps accidental, perhaps deliberate. Old Purbright crouched to examine it, aware that even trivial gestures could reveal attention or impatience. The village, he thought, was full of such gestures, minor traces left by those who observed without speaking. He stood and surveyed the courtyard. The convent was quiet. The parish office had closed. The evening air was calm, and yet in the quiet he felt the faint resonance of questions unanswered, letters unreceived, authority acknowledged only posthumously in absence. The door was locked, the record amended, the notice posted, but the mind that had noticed first remained absent. Purbright returned to his lodgings carrying little but the awareness of timing and consequence. He placed his notebook on the desk and opened it to the final entry, to reviewing the question he had written months earlier. Who benefits most when nothing is written down? He considered the village, the convent, the parish council, and concluded that benefit was less about individuals than about the system itself. Continuity, comfort, and procedural calm thrived where scrutiny was rendered inconsequential. Before extinguishing the lamp, he wrote one final note beneath the margin. And yet, someone always notices. He left the room without reading it again. Outside, the village lights gleamed steadily, the chapel door was closed, and a letter remained undelivered, as if in deference to discretion and absence alike. The case, in its quiet and proper way, was concluded, yet not entirely resolved. There remained the soft hum of attention, the possibility that even the smallest trace of curiosity could disturb the calm.